My name is Steve Hellmann. The folks at the library had asked me to do, well, it started out as like have a display in the entryway about model railroading. Yeah. And then we talked about a little further and said, well, if we put up the display, maybe we should go ahead and have an introductory discussion about the hobby as a follow-up. So the display was up in down at the entrance for the month of January. Kind of resurrected it here for the time being, but the objective for the discussion tonight was really to help people understand if model railroading is a hobby they would be interested in, and if so, what would be some things to know as you go about getting started. So I don't know, I know Matthew has been in this for a little while here and there. That's Matthew, and your name again was
Bill.
Bill.
And Paul.
And Paul. Do you folks already have model railroad, or you're just... You do, okay. Yeah. So you'll be able, and maybe is it something you're thinking about?
I did it when I was many moons ago.
You may be
when I was high school, junior high kind of ish.
Yeah.
That was many moons ago.
And
things have changed a little bit.
It's a common thing when you read about people getting in the hobby. It's a common thing to hear that maybe when they were a little kid they got a train set for Christmas and then they didn't do anything with it for X number of years, and then all of a sudden they decide to get back into it. Mm-hmm. But that's what we're trying to do, so is to really get into the more fundamentals of what's the hobby about and things of that nature. So if you've already been there and built one, it may be not really everything you wanted to know, but we can adjust based on what questions people may have. So one of the questions is, sometimes people ask about that hobby is, what is it that caused you to get interested in it? And I think of a couple things when I've talked to people and for myself. The model railroading offers an outlet for both, I would call it like a technical side of your personality, planning a layout, building bench work, building the layout, doing some wiring, maybe putting in a signal system. It's all kind of technical kind of stuff. But at the same time, it can appeal to an artistic side, because there's also the side of it that involves developing the scenery, possibly painting backdrops, weathering rail cars to make them look older. Things of that nature can kind of appeal to the artist in the person. So I don't know if anybody else has an idea of what might draw them to the hobby. It could have been from years ago having some equipment, or what was it that got you interested in it?
Well, I'm still running my first train that I got in 1953. So
okay.
So had a long time.
You've been in for a long time. And I know you had mentioned that you had some train systems from years ago.
I still have them. They're not up and running, but the whole model stuff has been cool, and trains actually move. So.
Oh, that's good.
Not like the static airplane or boat models.
Okay.
So that's always been kind of interesting.
But I know, Matthew, your dad was involved in the hobby for a while too, wasn't he?
Yes,
And
that's
that
what pulled me in.
And so he
And
kind
I'm
of pulled
still
you
here.
in, kicking and screaming, but you enjoy it. Okay. The one thing that I don't think we really have to dwell on it here, but sometimes people ask about the difference between model railroads and toy trains.
Toy trains.
And you're into toy trains?
Yeah.
And sometimes that can cause like violent arguments to break out at model railroad exhibitions and such things. If somebody would come up to something that someone believes is their model railroad built perfectly to scale and say, oh, look at that nice toy train. And they might be kind of upset about that. But it's kind of a humorous side to things. But the model railroading gets into more, just having track and trains going around in a circle, but really getting into very realistic layout, design, landscape, and some people take it to the extreme of having very precise operating sessions with multiple people running a railroad to an actual schedule, or having somebody acting as a dispatcher at a centralized traffic control point and controlling the trains on the layout, and possibly getting upset with each other if they break one of the operating rules of the railroad, things of that nature. But model railroading, I think, involves an array of different activities. I think there's, I kind of break it down into 6 different areas of activity, chronologically laid out. And I want to go over those 6 kind of areas of activities first and touch on them a little, and then really get into planning, because that will really impact on, you know, deciding about pursuing a model railroad and so on, and go more in depth on planning for today. Some of those other parts of the other elements of the 6 could be good for a future, you know, discussion, or possibly on-site training at an actual model railroad. But so, hey there. I've got a, did you get a handout?
Nope.
Oh, okay. We had really just gotten started. There's a handout for you. We're just getting started at number 3. We just talked a little bit about why people get into model railroading and so on. And so model railroading, one of the first areas of effort for the model railroader is planning. You really have to, at some point, decide what are you going to model, and you end up having to develop some kind of a track plan as a starting point. And we're going to go into more detail on some of that in just a little bit, but that'll be the focus of most of the meeting. The second phase is once you've decided what you want to model and you've got an actual track plan, you've really got to get into some of what we would call bench work. You need some kind of a support and flat kind of surfaces and such on which to build the railroad. And that can require a little bit of carpentry, but it's really basic carpentry. Maybe circular saws, electric drill, and electric screwdriver and such. Some plywood and some other dimensional lumber, and some nuts and bolts and screws. And without going into detail, there are, as I'll show you later on in the agenda, many resources for this. There are even books and pamphlets that are written entirely about model railroad bench work. And at least probably 1,000 YouTube videos that deal with model railroad bench work. There's probably 1 million overall on YouTube, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. So now you've decided what you want, you've made a track plan, and you've built bench work, and you've got a nice surface. You've got to draw some lines on there and lay out your track, and according to the plan. And it's good to have a plan. One thing that would be a subject of discussion for probably a whole, well, at least a half hour, maybe an hour, is aspects of track planning, which to people that aren't familiar might be kind of surprising, but there's things, in order to have a reliable model railroad, there are things that you want to avoid doing, like having one of the ones you see, you might see that, you know, it looks good when you think about it, but having a curve like this and then go immediately into another curve, for example. You can draw that on a paper and it'll look really cool, but it'll cause derailments in real life. So that's why track planning is a very significant subject, and it's important to understand some of the principles of good track laying before you go out and do it. And then, of course, after you've got your track all laid out, then you have to do wiring. And I kind of, with the diorama that I had thrown together, I kind of simulated that a little bit. You can see here, and those of you who have done it before realize it's not perfectly correct, but you've got electric bus wires running under the track, and then feeders going up and feeding the track at regular intervals. The thing that's probably not correct here is I used 22 gauge wire for the buses and the feeders, and if you're doing it obviously for a purpose other than just a demonstration, you might usually use something more like 16 or 18 gauge wire for your buses, and then 22 gauge for the feeders going up to the track. If you'd seen the display in the library, this kind of like illustrated kind of like from left to right, you know, how a model railroad might progress, going from, you know, bare plywood with some lines drawn on it, a little roadbed laid down, track is added, and then of course wiring is installed. And moving further along, you can see some of the additional elements as you get into scenery, adding some kind of soil and ground cover, rocks, landforms and such things, all are, you know, a part of the hobby. Now you can start running trains as soon as your track work and wiring is complete, and there's no problem with that. And then you can add your scenery, you know, as time goes on. But most of, how long did it take you to build your model railroad?
Mine is 4 years old now.
It usually isn't months, and it's oftentimes years. I think it's, for most people, it's not their primary occupation. They have other things to do. And the other thing that we find, I know around here, for me, model railroading takes place really from November through April, when it's cold outside. But
the boats.
right, and then, you know, in the summer, you know, the days are longer and it's nice. Go out, work in the garden, go bike riding, things like that. You know, wake up on a nice sunny day in July and say, I want to go down to the basement and work on the model railroad, unless it's raining. So anyway, so there's scenery. The interesting thing about scenery is there's a lot of ways to go about it, just like there's many ways to build bench work. I've done a lot of stacked foam, which is good. You know, there's pros and cons to that, I think. But there's always the old chicken wire that you can tack down and shape up the way you like and cover up with plaster cloth. Or if you want to be more economical, I've never done it, but people say you can make a slurry of plaster in a painting tray and just drag a chunk of paper towel through it. And that'll, you know, do the same thing, and you don't have to spend $11.99 on a roll of plaster cloth. But anyway, you see a little bit of that there, and there's my old standby, the stacked foam, and so on. But anyway, lastly, the last phase, of course, is you've got your railroad all built. Then you're totally in the operation phase, and realistically, a lot of people, do you operate pretty much by yourself, or?
Yeah, usually.
And yeah.
But you know, again, it's not, we're not talking scale operations. It's,
right.
It's running trains.
It's running trains.
Yeah.
And I have a layout, and I've never had anybody else operate it but me. But there are folks who do get together and have what's often called an operating session that could involve, like, on a really big layout. I've seen some on YouTube, and some of these are listed on the back. This one fellow, I've watched a lot of his videos. He goes by the name CNLVN on YouTube, and he films his operating sessions. And it sounds really pathetic, though, but to sit in your office at home and watch a model railroad operating session just seems kind of, you know, kind of silly or something. But it's kind of interesting, and you see these guys, you'll have like 5 or 6 of them operating the railroad, and somebody might be operating it as a dispatcher. Some of them can be very complicated, and they'll have a totally separate control panel, and they'll run all the turnouts from there. And the other guys, there's somebody that's a yard master, and he builds up trains, and the other guy takes the trains around and has somebody with him to do the switching and uncoupling and everything. So they could get to be very intense, but
is this pretty much the standard for what people have for model railroading? Or, because I know there's different sizes.
oh yeah, we're going to get into that in
Okay.
just a moment, I think.
Okay.
It is going to come up. Because what you're right, what you see here is HO. And down on number 5, we can talk a little bit about scales.
Okay.
Anyway, so that's what model railroaders do. They plan, they build bench work, they lay track, they wire it together so that it can run, and then they do scenery, build buildings. Sometimes these are all just show and tell, but there's all kinds of plastic kits you can go buy to build structures for on your layout. And there's even ones that are made of wood, laser cut balsa wood, kits like, there's a wide variety of kits available to build structures and so on. But, so what we'll really get into a bit more detail though is planning. And so one of those first questions you run into is, what are you going to model? So a question might be, what are the things that influence you to get into model railroading in the first place? Are you interested because when you were a child maybe there was a rail yard near your home, Or maybe you've traveled a lot by train. Maybe perhaps someone lived in Chicago and rode the Metro into downtown every day and traveled through the Union Pacific and BNSF yards, you know, on the way in and out to work every day. Those are the kinds of things that can influence what you might want to model. Or perhaps you have a relative, father or an uncle that worked in a particular industry, like the steel industry, or maybe was involved in iron ore mining in Minnesota. And so those would all be things that could point to ideas about what you might like to model. Another question that comes up, you'll see, is the old, there's the prototype on the one end and the freelance model railroad on the other end. And the prototype guys, they try to go out and duplicate a chunk of a railroad that existed in real life. If they take it to the extreme, they go out and find, you know, look at maps, find out where the tracks were, try to build structures that match or are very similar to what was in those towns along the way, and they try to run the exact equipment that railroad might have run. Someone might say, well, I'm going to model Altoona, Pennsylvania to the horseshoe curve. Now, they can't do all of that in their basement, so they do some selective compression. They pick out certain elements of Altoona and then the horseshoe curve, and maybe instead of having whatever there might be in real life, 10 towns along the way, maybe they only model 2 of those towns and only to a little. But they will try to do it fairly close, and one could hear of people who operate their railroad like on a particular date in history. Like, what was the schedule on that day? They've been able to find this out. And you wonder, where do they get that from? And out there in the world, there are a number of railroad historical societies. Every one of them has at least 1 or maybe 2 or 3. And they amass like the timetables and pictures and all this stuff, the oral histories from the people that worked on those roads in the past. And so all that's out there and can help you. But on the other end of the spectrum is kind of, I know where I mostly go is what is called freelance. In a total freelancing way on the other end, you just do whatever you want. And you can buy locomotives from any railroad you want. You put them on your railroad. Your scenery doesn't match anything. You just do what you want to do. I, like many people personally, I'm kind of in the middle, which were called the proto-lancers, where I model New Mexico in the 1990s, but I don't pick a particular location, but I use BNSF freight trains principally. I have an Amtrak train because the Southwest Chief goes through there every day in each direction, and I model the 90s, so I have, among other things, I do have a lot of intermodal equipment on my layout. But I haven't said I'm modeling the BNSF from Albuquerque down to Belen or something, and rigorously sticking with that. I've got a passenger station on my layout that matches the one in Lamy, New Mexico, for example, but it's nothing that I'm that worried about. As Paul down at Engine House Services, he's the owner of that shop. I don't know, they may edit that out because I don't think we're supposed to mention for-profit businesses in a presentation at the library. But he's always said, it's your railroad, do what you want. And you can't worry too much about what other people say. Just recently I was laughing about something I saw on the internet. I was doing some research to see what a retaining wall might look like. And I stumbled on one of these, what do they call it, a thread, a discussion thread at one of the model railroad websites. And one guy was just blasting every model railroader that would use a retaining wall. So they don't exist in real life, and when people have them, they overuse them, and it's usually an excuse for bad track planning. And then several people attacked him and said, no, there are such things in real life. I know there are. I've seen them between Chicago and Albuquerque. I've seen many. Anyway, you know how the internet is nowadays. It's easy enough to, you can throw something out there and you can upset 3 or 4 people. Anyway, geography is another thing that's involved in planning. Specifically, do you have like geographical preferences? Do you like to model mountains? Do you like farm fields with corn? Do you want a river? They're all choices you can make, and they come with some implications. Like if you're just gonna model the flatlands of the Midwest, you're not gonna have to stack a whole lot of foam. You do need some relief because there are drainage ditches alongside the tracks and things like that. But you're not gonna have a lot of mountains maybe, but you might get into how do you model a cornfield or a wheat field and things like that. The other thing, water is another good one. In New Mexico, one reason I picked that is I don't have to model water. There is some water in various places, the Rio Grande, and it's about this deep when it goes through Albuquerque. But water can be modeled, and a lot of people like to do it and have a nice bridge over the water, but it requires a little extra. Have you ever modeled any water?
I have some.
Okay. And you know, there's certain, at the model railroad shop or wherever, they'll be very happy to sell you the various resins and things that mimic water. Mix them together in a cup and then pour it out and all that. And there's many videos on YouTube that people will be happy to show you how to model water. I think it's actually challenging. I'd rather build mountains than model water. I think for water to look good, it is a challenge. It's not easy, and so on.
How big a set do you have, or size-wise?
Well, now I'm quite trained, so I'm at the other end of the spectrum.
He's at that
beyond reality.
Some of the
fantasy, and it's an 8.5 by 16 foot layout.
Okay.
So it's a medium-sized oak.
Is it in? It's in O.
It's an oak.
Okay.
Lionel size. Yeah.
I don't know what size, I know that I got a train set, and I know about what size it is, so when I heard that you were here, I thought,
Oh yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah. Moving quickly along. Era is another thing. There's a lot of people that like to model the steam era, and they really just want to have steam locomotives. They're into the 30s and 40s and into the 50s and such. And then then in the 50s, the transition came to move to diesel. And by the time you got into the later 60s, almost everybody was into diesel. Some people like to model what they call the transition era, where railroads had some steam locomotives, but they had the earliest diesel, so they could have kind of the blend of both worlds. And I model the 1990s, but I have a steam locomotive. But I cheated. I have on my layout is a railroad museum. And sitting at the Railroad Museum is the Union Pacific train set and a Santa Fe 484 steam locomotive, because today Union Pacific regularly runs outings with their E9 equipment and such, painted in its 1950s kind of design. And of course, well, the Union Pacific, again, they run a lot of steam in their heritage program. So I decided one way you can run anything you want on your railroad is have a model railroad, have a railroad museum on it. Then you have an excuse to have anything from any railroad you want, and you can take it out for excursions. Industries are another interesting thing. Many industries have lent themselves to model railroading. If I was, based on going to many of the model railroad shows, you've been to a lot, what do you think would be the #1 industry? It might be a matter of opinion. I'm putting you on the spot.
Well, I think a lot of that is influenced by what Walters has made kits for.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
So, let's see, coal mining.
Coal mining, and going with that is
Let's
they
see,
do a lot.
pulpwood, logging.
Steel, you know, and there's a, you know, some of, and in fact, Walters has like a whole guidebook on how to model like the steel industry, or how do you model this industry. Obviously they're trying to help the model railroaders figure out how to spend the most possible money on their various kits and things. But you could imagine, you know, some people, there's some folks that at the model railroad show in Green Bay, they'll be there, they do a logging thing. And they even just have a point-to-point, back-and-forth thing, but it's extremely well done. You've probably seen, anyway, they're really nice. Logging is another industry people like, and that lends itself to narrow gauge. Passenger railroad, shipbuilding. You know, like if someone was interested, you could model the Anape and Western, Green Bay and Western. In an area like this size, you could have Green Bay, Algoma, and Sturgeon Bay. And you could have shipyard in Sturgeon Bay, because back through the war era, they were served by the railroad for delivery of steel and things. So industries are always, you know, if there's an industry a modeler likes, you can go after that industry. Meatpacking is another one that I saw an article about recently. It's really nice. You can have a string of stock cars coming in, and then you got refrigerated box cars filled with meat going out. Maybe not so much nowadays, most of that truck. So planning what scale, and you were talking about scale earlier. N scale, many of you may know this because you've been involved, is 1 to 160. HO is 1 to 87, and O is 1 to 48. And I forget that, there's something smaller, that's Z, that's 1 to 220 scale. It's not quite half the size of N, but it's pretty tiny. And another one that's got a little bit of a niche is the S scale, which is in the 1 to, I think it's 1 to 64. But in the world of the model railroading, about 60% of the hobby, I've been reliably told, is in HO. It is, on average, it is the most popular scale. The others, you know, fight for the rest. But I think N is popular in O, and then Z and S would be, you know, further out there with only a few percent. But the scale is an important question. These are HO, and I find them easy to work with, especially being in my late 50s and eyesight and things. You know, HO works really well. I don't really want to work with something smaller than that. It would be hard. I brought along as an example, I was going to illustrate that point. I built these signals over the weekend for my railroad, and you could pass around and look at them briefly, but you know, for me this is as small as I can work with. If I was trying to make those in N, they would be half that size. I got to thread those 28 gauge wires through there and do all that work. And so this is an illustration of, this is why I like HO, is I can work with this, but something half that size, it would probably be beyond what I want to do. But anyway, and then you're working there at your bench, and one thing you always do is, whenever I'm working with anything, I pretty much always drop something on the floor. And then I got to go down and find it.
Usually a little black screw.
It's usually something black. And then one of those pieces, I'll get into tools for a second. This is one of those tools I like to have, is my head. Oops, I don't like it flashing like that, but this is really good for working with those fiddly bits and the magnifying glass, which I didn't bring as a sample. But you know, your N, you're going to be able to get twice as much railroad in a space as HO. Do you know what I mean by that? You have more equipment, more scenery, because the scale is half the size. Now, if you go with O, I think you do need a good sized space, and I don't know what your turning radius would be on that.
Depends on what equipment.
It depends on the equipment. That's a good point.
If you want to run some of the full-scale, large steam engines or even diesels, you need to have an 072 minimum, 72-inch curve.
Yeah, I did some G scale once, and that was a 5-foot radius.
Yeah.
That was what you had to deal with. So
The house that I bought had a train set in the basement. And the engine, I guess you'd have pellets for steam you'd put down.
Yeah.
But the engine is like yay big, and probably like this, and weighs about
Sounds like
7 pounds. Or,
Sounds like an OGH engine.
yeah,
you know, it's heavy, and it
it was very common.
7 cars.
And now there's some liquids you can even put down the funnel, and that'll generate some simulated speed.
But I saw on your unit over there, you had the wire underneath.
Oh yeah, for electricity.
From what I understood for this unit that I have, you had a transformer, and they just had one rail that, you know, was hooked up to the transformer, and then that powered.
Sure. And it's most basic, that's what it is,
Okay.
you know. And but as you get into a more permanent layout, you know, you're going to want to hide some of that stuff. And particularly with the modern systems, with the digital systems, you know, things get fun because they're complicated.
Because the track that he had in his basement was 16 by 24.
Okay, it probably was an O scale.
Yeah.
And there's the part of that I do understand is the old, you know, Lionel with three rail systems.
Yep, that's what this has.
Okay. And
That simplifies wiring.
it simplifies wiring.
Oh, okay.
Thanks for
I've been called
stopping.
out to something else, I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. So, anyway, so we talked about eyesight and the use of space, more railroad with a smaller scale, but more fiddly bits and little things you can drop on the floor. And it's easier to put these on the rail. There's railing tools, of course, to use. But you had mentioned turning radius. These passenger cars here, made by Walters, are a minimum 24-inch radius. So, I mean, you can run them on something smaller than that, but you risk derailments. And also, it just looks bad because it's kind of hard to explain, but if you turn them on too tight a radius, they end up looking like this.
Right.
And then your prototype people really get peeved when they see that. But on my railroad, even with 24-inch, they still probably look like this. But 24-inch is fairly common for this kind of equipment. If you were modeling the 30s and 40s, you'd have more 40-foot boxcars, shorter equipment, and then it's easier to do. And this is probably,
That will take a 15.
this will take a
without
15-inch turning radius, this equipment here. So, the thing that we would say about this is, and I think I wrote on there, on a 4x8 foot sheet of plywood, you can't turn a semi-modern kind of contemporary HO train. You've got a 24-inch minimum radius, which means your one rail on the outside is going to be over the edge, because it's the radius is to the center of the track. That's the way I look at it, at least. And so you need more than 48 inches to have a train go around like that. And so you really need pretty much 5 inches. But if you wanted to do 4x8, you can, but it might influence the equipment you have. Like Matthew said, this will turn on 15 inches. And a lot of these boxcars, those will turn on 15 inches. But most of this, what would I say, probably like 1970s and beyond equipment with 6-axle locomotives, most of that's going to be 24-inch minimum radius. And of course, the purists would say, you know, all this stuff looks better if you do it with 36-inch or something like that. And it does look better.
Sure.
And what do you have there? You've got your
Yeah, this is
your
a locomotive from about 1873.
Right.
Oh, let's see,
Then
what
you've
else
got
do I
your,
have in the toy box? Going upward, at the other end of the spectrum, I brought one of these,
Aha.
a big boy.
the big boy, and that's probably another pretty significant turning radius, I would guess.
This one was actually,
Well,
this
with the
built-
separate trucks, it probably would turn pretty
this
well.
will take an 18 with
It'll
a little
take
bit
an
of
18.
whining.
The manufacturers are very good when you look in the catalogs and that. They'll typically tell you in there. If it needs a minimum radius, they'll specify it and say.
And with the O gauge, the Lionel size trains, you have a couple different sizes even there. You've got kind of a traditional size, which are all condensed. Most of the trains out of the 1950s, and so we're all condensed models.
Okay.
Okay, so they aren't full scale. Nowadays, in the O-scale market, you get a lot of full scale locomotives. Number one, they're extraordinarily pricey, and number two, they're very large. And so, like on my layout, I run a lot of traditional sized equipment, and then Lionel has actually built some highly detailed but slightly compressed engines that I can run. And I have one of the loops on my layout is actually an 072 loop, so I could theoretically run big equipment if I wanted to. But that's all part of the planning. You decide what you want to run. I'm just not going to spend the kind of money it takes to have the full-scale equipment, typically.
And cost isn't, in a way, you may have an opinion about this too, but the smaller scale doesn't necessarily mean less expensive. You know, when you go out and look at N-scale locomotives, they can, I mean, they're not half the cost of an HO. Now this one, the A and the B, I didn't bring along. As a 2-unit set, it has sound. It's like $349. Now something like this, with just a regular DCC computer control, and I'll touch on that in a second, is probably more like a $100 kind of locomotive. You can get a locomotive without a computer chip kind of doodad, a computer board, and they'll go down to $79 in HO. But but it's not,
Yeah,
it's
I know.
not,
No.
it's not. And I did forget a handout I had made today, which was about, I just did like a pro forma kind of idea. What does it cost to make a 12 by 13 foot railroad with, you know, one big bent loop and a small yard and 2 industries and a passing siding, and with 2 trains and doing digital command control, and with lumber and everything, you're up to like $3,000 without even getting, not even yet into the scenery. It's like, but anyway, I think you guys know the difference between scale and gauge, by the way. You would be knowledgeable about that. Sometimes people get that confused when you're talking about it, but okay. So another planning consideration on number 6 there is the size. So where would you build a layout? And they can end up in garages and basements and things like that principally. In Model Railroader, I've seen a couple of layout stories where the people lived in Florida or some such place, and they had like a 3-car garage, and they built the Model Railroad in at one end of the garage. And that's fine in Florida, but it probably is not as good an idea up here. So in a lot of cases, the Model Railroaders are relegated to the basement, perhaps, or if you're fortunate enough, if you have a house with a large bedroom that's spare, you can do it in there. But I know I've always been in the basement and so on. But what kind of space do you have to work with down there? And again, if you want to, you can start drawing some plans and see like, well, draw a plan that shows what is my available space. And if you're in the basement, allow for the furnace repairman to still get to it. And the plumber's got to get to the water heater. You don't want to like build your layout right up to those things. That's probably pretty obvious. But we've talked about turning radius and how you'll have to know going in as you're starting to think about it. Are you going to run stuff that can run on an 18-inch? N scale common is like 9 and 12-inch radiuses. That would be equivalent to 18 and the 24s of HO. There again, so you can get a lot more in a smaller space. Another thing to consider that I've seen people do this thing where they're like, oh, I'm going to build a railroad. I'm going to build a railroad. It's going to be, it's really going to be kind of like a figure 8, and I'm going to have a bridge here, and this is going to be on your 4 by 8 foot sheet of plywood. And it's like, well, it may not work, because if you're going to take this one track and run it over the other one, it's probably got to be about 4 inches higher in order for you can see what, especially like, well, if you're running modern double stack equipment like this, you need 4 inches. That's what I work with. So how are you going to, over this kind of distance, from there going up to there, how are you going to get up 4 inches? If you're going to have a 2% grade, which the modern railroads really don't like much worse than 2%, they prefer 1%. But to go up 2 inches only, you need 100 inches of track to go up 2 inches. I have a 4% grade on mine, but I like that because there is a 3.5% kind of grade in New Mexico on Raton Pass. And it's kind of realistic because the train comes around the corner off the flat and it hits that and starts going up that 4% grade, it slows down. But it does in real life too. But there again, with my 4% grade, my incline starts 8 feet from where I need it to be at 4 inches in order for it to pass over the other track. And it's 8 feet. So again, it's a planning consideration. You think, oh, I can do this, but you can't. Well, maybe you can, but well, some of the people, the purists would say it looks stupid having what might be an 8% grade. The other thing is you need a lot of power if your train is long. Maybe on a 4 by 8 foot layout, your train isn't that long, maybe. Anyway, I don't know. Anyway, it's just an ideal. And other things to think of are aisles and access and reaching distances. You want to be able to get to your layout, so you might not want to have a layout that's like like a really big square. It depends on how far you can reach. But you do want to be able to reach to your stuff. I know I've got a spot on my train where I've got to bring up a stool to be able to reach over to. It was a compromise that I made, though, because I needed kind of a big bulbous area to turn trains around, and it had to go up to the wall. So in that one spot, I gotta get up on my stool if I wanna reach over there. But hopefully the trains won't ever derail in that segment of the track. But anyway, another thing to consider along those lines is if you think in your mind, I'm gonna build this really wonderful layout and I'm gonna get 3 or 4 guys to come by and have operating sessions, your aisles have to be big enough for 2 people to pass. And I've got a spot on my layout where it's only in one little nook, but I'm the only one that could be there. And you know, there's no room for 2 guys. If one guy's working the intermodal yard, he's got to stand on the other side because the other guy's working the regular yard building a train. But it's only me, so it doesn't really matter. But it would be something to take into account. The other thing that sometimes people don't think too much about when they're first getting into it is, what is your height off the floor? Tables are generally going to be about 30 inches, your dining room table. Your kitchen counter is going to be about 36 inches or thereabouts. But your model railroad, you might want to think about making it higher. I'm at 48 inches. But that seems like if you're playing with your trains, you don't want to be standing over them looking down at them like this. I mean, it'd be really cool if they were up at this level, but when you get them up at that height, now your reaching distance is really bad. But I think something in the mid to upper 40s can be very common. How high off the ground are you with yours?
Well, mine was designed so that kids could look at it
See,
as
that's
they
a
stood next to
consideration.
it and see it at their eye level.
Sure.
So it's not, it may be
30?
38.
It may not be 36, but it's
Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
real tall.
it is kind of nice when you can go up to it and look out over it,
Yeah.
and your eyes are closer to it. But you're right, it's a consideration. If you were working in a train and you wanted young people to be involved with it, you're
Yeah.
going to build at a different height then.
Because mine's toy trains, of course, I've got all the operating Lionel accessories around
Yeah.
the layout and the buttons for kids to push and do things like that, so they've got to be able to see it and get right up to it, so mine can't be too tall. It's tall enough for me to sit underneath it and work on it, which was a consideration.
I built my first one and I looked at the World's Greatest Hobby video and I think they had built to like 42 inches. And then I decided I didn't like 42 inches. And the next time I built, I went to 48. And I'm happy with that. But you could be, and when you look at your, sometime if you get into it, you look at your, I don't know, I brought one. You look at your model railroader magazine, and they have wonderful diagrams of layouts. And they usually tell you right in there, for example, what are the heights of all the different spots. So here you say,
Sure.
here, this track is at 46, you see
Yeah.
this one's at 52,
Yeah.
and they've got to clear each other.
49 and then 37.
And sometimes in this magazine, because you've probably seen, or maybe you follow one of the other Kalmbach publications.
Yeah,
for
well,
more
O-gauge.
Sometimes they don't give you a number so much as they give you the base of it is at 0, and then they just give you a reference and say, well, this track here, this is at 6 inches and this is at 8 or whatever. But anyway, so that's a good consideration too, is your height. Number 7 was budget, and we did talk a little bit about that prematurely, but you know, you can get into it for big bucks, and I know I'm into it for at least that $3,000 number with, you know, what I've got.
But you know, that's where your planning helps.
That's where planning can help.
Because it's real easy to buy a whole bunch of stuff you don't need,
Yeah,
or you buy it and then you find out it doesn't work the way you thought it would.
then you do it over again.
But the planning helps you avoid a lot of that,
Yeah,
you know.
that's a good point, and I know I've reused chunks of my old layouts,
Yeah.
and that's good, but I've also scrapped some lumber too. And you don't want to be making 18 trips to the lumber yard either.
Yeah.
Planning is very important, and I will mention,
Fun, actually.
I enjoy it, and I used to sit in my easy chair and I had, what did I do? I grabbed my wife's big cutting board, because I could sit in my easy chair and put the cutting board on my lap and my compass and pencils and sit and draw things, because I didn't have a big enough desk on which to do it. But I could sit for hours and plan a model railroad, and there's a guy made a living out of it, John Armstrong. He did that for a living.
John Armstrong designed my dad's layout.
Okay.
It was several $100s, and that was in 1995. And
Yeah.
he's dead, so you
He's
can't
dead,
buy
so
it.
you can't have him do it anymore. Anyway, that's good. And the other thing you'll get into, you know, if you get into the hobby, there's things you may not have at home now that you would want to have. These are just samples. You know, you probably want to have an electric meter. You're going to need, well, it's not essential, but one of these little things for measuring little things can be helpful at different times. Your very small files and things when you build kits and such. If you do, you know, you can't go upstairs to my wife's medicine cabinet and get her tweezers, and that doesn't work after a while. Hi. So you go out and for $18.14 at Engine House Services, you can get a set of 4 tweezers of different types. And your wire strippers that you do your household wiring with, which is all going to be 12 and 14 gauge wire typically, well, you can set them aside because you're going to need to strip 22 and 24 and 26 gauge wire. So you'll have to get another wire stripper and a little set of mini screwdrivers. You'll probably want to have a light thing for on your head. If you don't have one, a soldering iron becomes very important. This is something I made myself, because like sometimes I'd find I'm trying to solder 2 things together, but I got my soldering iron in one hand and I've got solder in the other hand, and now I'm out of hands, so I use this, and even, you know, it comes in handy even like when I'm putting these together the other day. You know, I can clamp it in there and use the other one to hold the wire or whatever, and then I can solder it. But for a long time I didn't have anything like that. You can buy something like that from Micromark. Micromark is a company, they have a little catalog and they sell all kinds of tiny tools and things for craftspeople. They're very big with people who build ship models and do model railroading. They have something for about $30 that has like 4 different arms, and it's got a magnifying glass one, and I think maybe even something else on it, I don't remember.
I got one down at the one of the shows for $5.
That's a good reason to go to a model railroad
The
show.
exact same thing
lot of
that's in the
arms.
Micromark catalog, the Helping Hands, you can buy them at Harbor Freight for like 7 or 8.
There you go. Or you take a scrap piece of wood and some stiff solid wire, like 12 gauge, and buy some alligator thingies and
Yours actually looks more usable than what I have.
know.
I'm jealous.
and then you get some. There's other things you'll spend money on, like what does this thing cost? This is like $12 for this little piece of metal.
But the proceeds go to a good cause.
The National Model Railroad Association sells these. This one is the HO version, and what it does, it has a track gauge thing. You can check your track gauge, flangeways, wheels. If you're having problems with your locomotive, your equipment, you can check to see are the wheels engaged. This is also good for clearance. You can put it on your railroad and see you need this for clearance side to side and up and down. So if you're putting trees alongside your road, this will help you avoid that kind of problem. And like I said, this is like $12 for this, but it goes to the NMRA, so it's not a bad thing.
The board that you have there is numbered 1 to 12.
Well, this is a doodad. For about $8 or $9, you can buy this thing, which is a coupler height gauge. And what you do with this is you put your rolling stock on it and make sure that the coupler is at the correct height, which has been decided by the National Model Railroad Association. They have a standard. And then you measure the length. And the ideal weight, according to the NMRA standard, is, NMRA recommended practice 20-1 says your rail car should weigh 1 ounce plus a ½ ounce for each additional inch. So this car should weigh, if it was ideal, 1 ounce, and it's 11 inches long, so another, whatever that is, 5.5. It should weigh 6.5 ounces for optimum performance. Anyway, that's what that is. So by the time, you know, we mentioned that mythical like 12 by 12 L-shaped layout and the $3,000, well, you've got probably, you're going to end up spending another $100 or $200 buying, you know, all kinds of other ancillary stuff.
Although you may already have
You may already.
Quite a bit of it.
If you have a soldering iron, you won't need a new one and all that. But some of this stuff I know. Oh, and then there's another one here that was show and tell time. This is your scale ruler, model railroader scale ruler. It's got distances in feet, in HO and O, and in N scale. So, like when I was working on building these guys here, the company I bought them from, it doesn't tell you how tall it should be, but I looked on the internet and found that the Santa Fe usually had a 16-foot tall signal, so I could take my scale ruler and put it up next to it and see if it's really 16 feet tall. If I can move this base up and down, it will, until I put it on the layout. But, so these scale ruler, and what do you think this costs? It's probably $7.95 or something. Anyway, the point is, you know, you'll get into the hobby, and then, like I said, the things can mount up after a while, so you want to be kind of, you know, ready for that.
What's the powder in
Pardon?
your jar?
Oh, this is more show and tell stuff. This was, this is yellow grass fine turf from Woodland Scenics, $10.29 for a bottle. But and you can buy this gravel that's your ballast. That goes for about $10 or $12 for a bottle this size as well. Or you can use cat litter. I've been told cat litter, you know, you got to get the right kind because you want it to look like gravel. But anyway, if there's some questions about that, that's that. I think many of you guys are familiar with track. The other big expense can be track, and track. This piece of flex track is what's very commonly used nowadays. In the old world, it was really what you'd call sectional track, and you'd buy pieces of different. This is a. See, I'm doing my. Somewhere on there it said, this is actually 24-inch radius curve, and but you can go and buy this. You can buy 18, 24, 15-inch radius, and you put all the pieces together. But what we tend to do nowadays is you buy this flex track, and it'll do kind of whatever you want it to do, and work with that. This is about. Let's see. I think you pay Paul about $5 and wait. It's about $5 a piece in round numbers. Flex track. So it's like, it's not bad, but if you're laying 60 feet of track, you need 20 of these, so you got $100. What's really fiercely expensive are the turnouts, and the turnout in HO will typically run from $20 to $30 for that. The worst thing, these are like gold. I thought about bringing an armed guard with me. A curved turnout, $40 for one of these, for a curved turnout from Walters. And I used it on a previous layout, and I'm saving it for sure. I may need it again someday. But they're, you know, like you said, those things can add up quick. We mentioned the other thing in your planning and your expense. Model railroading was typically run with direct current over the many years, and you use direct current. You know, the transformer with DC power, or maybe
AC.
Or AC. And the within the last, what has it been, Matthew? Like the last 20 years?
1997 was when they finally got. There were eccentric people with soldering irons that were building the stuff back in the 70s, but there were several competing formats. And then it took until 1997 before the NMRA finally got a workable set of standards, mostly based off of what Lenz was building. And then this went from, no, that they had standards, the manufacturers could make it go mainstream, and systems like this probably have 90-some% market penetration by this point.
And this is, these systems that Matthew referred to, Lenz, Digitrax, and NCE, and maybe a couple others, are manufacturers who produce digital command control equipment. It's more expensive than direct current, but what it does for you is it allows you to have multiple operators and multiple trains all on the same track. Because you can imagine if you have a track powered by a transformer with direct current, if you have two trains on that track, when you turn the throttle up, they're both going to speed up and then they're both going to slow down. What they did with this is they use alternating current in a square wave, and they can embed codes in the power transmission to address a specific locomotive. And thus, you can run multiple trains on the track, multiple operators, and they can all speed up and slow down, different from each other. And then these things, this Zephyr set goes for, I bought it probably 10 years ago, it was like $150. I think they're now about $180. And then another, you can run your trains right from here, and you press the buttons to select a train, you name them. Like, I use 2 digits on my road, this is number 76. So I programmed that train, that locomotive, to respond to number 76. I can select it, speed it up, slow it down. I could select another train on this very same module and tell it to do something different, but then I get confused. You also can buy, they're very happy to sell you for more money, a walk-around throttle. And on my layout, I have multiple places where you can plug it in. This is still the central brain, and it can control dozens of locomotives, but I can communicate with the central brain walking anywhere around the layout. And of course, for a little bit more money, you get this in the radio version, thus you don't have a cord. And they will work infrared or radio too, and then you're not tethered.
One thing I'd like to bring out, radio throttles, to get your first one with the transmitter, receiver, and then the handheld unit, you're looking at close to $400 total, and then each additional one you add is going to be about another $200. The way things are going right now is an app called Y-Throttle. You have a computer, you have a little brain box and a cable that plugs into your other brain box, and an app on your phone. And you can run your trains off of your phone using the Wi-Fi equipment that you already have.
I can run mine off the iPad.
Yeah.
Wow.
You can get a, and I had an app on my phone I can run. I can do certain things on it.
My layout has its own Wi-Fi router, and it just connects.
There's an important point there that I think is good to understand. All these things in model railroading, you can do as much or little of it as you want.
Exactly.
If you don't want to build bench work, you can buy bench work. There's a guy up on Washington Island, Sievers, who builds bench work. You can go to his website, and he can build your bench work for you. If you're really into computers, you can go crazy with that. There's stuff like Java Model Railroad Interface. It's freeware kind of thing. You put it on your computer, you can hook your Digitrack stuff up to the computer, and you can do all kinds of stuff from your computer, but you don't have to.
Sure.
You know, I'm happy with tethered operation with this $150 thing, but my first railroad was direct current, and I'm like, well, I want to run 2 trains at once. And now I'm having a hard time. I did do it at first. You block out sections and get another little hand switch device, toggle switches, that says which power pack is controlling which segment of track. But then I had issues with that too. So I went with this. You can do that.
The old gauge world has 2 competing systems that are somewhat compatible. Lionel's digital command system, the legacy system, and then my MTH, the competition with his own digital system, and we use just handhelds. It's all radio, and you can throw switches. You can run as many trains as you want in any direction you want. You can operate accessories. You can initiate sounds.
I was watching a program on PBS about model railroading, and that was amazing. It looked like they had O, they had the HO, and I mean, it was outside, in the side of the hill. It was amazing.
Give you one of
And then
the handouts.
it just, you know, Walters was the big one, and they kind of took you through their shop. Wow.
Walters is pretty big in that field. Let's see.
There's still a big outfit, Walters?
Yeah, probably the biggest. Isn't it kind of funny? It almost seems like Milwaukee is like a world headquarters for model railroading. Walters is headquartered there, so is Model Railroader magazine, Kalmbach Publications in Athens.
How about Barney?
They're still out there. I don't know. some of the manufacturers you don't see as much nowadays. Let's see, we were gonna talk, number 8, about resources. A lot of our resources around here, northeast Wisconsin, you know, Green Bay is of course the place. There is, if you don't want to build your own model railroad, but you want to get into the hobby, a good way to go at it is with a club. So then you work on the club's layout. You could buy your own equipment and run it on the club's track, and you just run the club's equipment, that kind of thing. The Green Bay Area Model Railroad Club is currently, they're in De Pere at the Crest Library, down in the basement. They're always in the basement, aren't they? Anyway, they used to be on Packerland Drive, but now they're there. So they're out there, and they're a good resource. If you want to learn more, you can go by. I think their operating sessions are open to the public, and that's, you can go by, call them up. You can find them on the internet, call them up. They meet and work and such on Thursdays. And then one Thursday of the month, they have kind of a business meeting, which is like more for members. But the other, I mean, they're happy to have people stop by.
That's true with the Old Gauge Club there too.
Where is that?
Northeast Wisconsin, at Titletown.
It's in okay. And
They run on Saturdays.
another nice thing in Green Bay is, it is a for-profit business, I'll mention. It's Engine House Services is one of the big stores in Green Bay, and there's also a store on Velp, and they are really focused more on, they're really into more Lionel and the O gauge and larger.
Green Bay trains.
Yeah. And nice thing, I don't know, do they do clinics at all or anything like that? I'm not familiar with them doing that.
No.
One nice thing Engine House does is Engine House Services on there's no fee, it is a free resource on Tuesdays and Saturdays. Tuesday nights at 6:30 and on Saturdays starting at 1, they have clinics. And on their website they tell you what the clinics are by subject. So you can go there and learn things.
And for the serious modeler, the techniques you use to build a realistic HO layout are not going to be that much different
Right.
than an O gauge layout.
Yeah.
You know, whether you're weathering equipment or building mountains, I mean, it's bigger in O gauge,
Yeah.
but that's not it, you know.
Train shows, another good resource. There are 3 big shows in our, well, there's many, but I think, 3 of the biggest ones. In April of every year, there's Titletown Train Show, which of course is in Green Bay it's been at Shopko Hall. I don't know if they still call it Shopko Hall anymore. Shopko's in trouble.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll get someone else for the naming rights, I don't know. But that's every April. This year, in fact, I made a note, it's coming April 27, 28, Saturday, Sunday. Those train shows are great because they're usually going to have 30 or 40 or more operating layouts. Clubs have portable layouts. They set them up. The people there, they love to talk about their train layouts. You can't shut them up sometimes. Well, some of them are kind of shy and withdraw, and they'll stay in the middle and they won't talk to you. But if you go up and try to talk to them about trains, they'll be happy to help. And there will be vendors there, and people selling stuff. And as I think you guys had mentioned, there's a lot of guys that are selling, gather up used equipment, tools and whatnot, and they sell it at the model railroad shows. So it's a great resource. One of the other big ones was just last weekend at Madison. If we'd had this last Tuesday on schedule, I would have been able to tell you next weekend is the Madison show. Mm-hmm. And that one's huge. It's at, I can't remember the name, Alliant Energy Center or some such thing. It's down at the Dane County Coliseum kind of area there. Very big show. And the other big one that happens in Wisconsin area is Train Fest, which is always in November. This year, November 9-10. It's usually in the first half of November down at Milwaukee in State Fair Park at the exhibition center. Very nice. Now there's other shows besides those 3 the biggest ones in Wisconsin. There's one at La Crosse, and there's one they do, what is that town that has like a strawberry festival? Wapaka, they have a model railroad show.
Point.
And there's other places, other things you can do, like the folks in Green Bay have not so much a show as a sale at the Riverside Ballroom from time to time. And they're not big on operating railroads set up to exhibit, but there's all kinds of guys there selling stuff secondhand.
So I got my helping hands.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a good place to find a really good bargain there. And you just get to see the historic Riverside Ballroom, which I'm always surprised in a way it's still there. You can imagine some of those guys, like those guys that died in the plane crash, and Buddy Holly and them used to play at that place.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah,
it's still
sure.
there, it's kind of interesting. And I do want to mention, of course, the library, because they're good enough to help with all this, but the library, within the, I think of it as Owl's Neck, the library's network, that's all on InfoSoup. They've got a few dozen books, and in particular, if I was making a recommendation, I'd say they've got about a dozen of the books published by Model Railroader magazine, like how to build benchwork and how to do wiring and things like that. The book that I really liked, they had for many years, and I checked it out several times, and was John Armstrong's book, Model Railroad Track Planning for Realistic Operation. It is the, I think, and some people would say it is the Bible, it's the single best book on track layout planning. And he'll give you a lot of those factors, like if you're going to do one of those S-curves, believe it or not, there's a standard for after you come out of one curve, you need to go for a certain amount of distance straight before you curve the other way. Depends on the scale and other factors, but he's got a chart that explains that. And all kinds of other useful information. When you have two side-by-side tracks going through a curve, you need a different distance between the center lines than when it's straight track. Here you need a couple inches, but there you need 2.5. Because as the cars go through the curve,
Sure.
you can imagine
They go over.
on parallel tracks going through a curve, they're going to do this. So you need, anyway, so that book unfortunately is no longer available through our library network. Like I said, they had it for many years, and when I was planning this exhibit back in December, I came to look for it. It's like, it's not here. And I went down into the Friends. I thought, well, maybe they took it out of circulation and put it down there for sale. And I scoured that down there looking for it, and I couldn't find it. I asked the librarian, I said, do you know what happened to it? You know, did you send it to another? No, it's not anywhere in the network anymore. Really good resource, that one. There's several publications, and I don't mean to push it in particular, but Model Railroader magazine is very good. But there's also magazines that the O-scalers would be particularly interested in, and you may have a sample there.
I do.
Railroad Model Craftsman is another magazine
This
that's
is old gauge
published.
railroading, and
Yeah.
Okay, so that's for all
you
you
can
can
just
just,
read them online, and we'll talk
It's
about
the
all of
modern
them.
way to do it.
Yeah, it is. It's really nice. But,
I gotta get one of those. I don't like to read those things online on my smartphone. It's just not quite big enough. But
yeah, no,
Yeah.
this is, they get
yeah.
everything from track planning, all of the various really great work that's done by some of the modelers, which is really fantastic.
they're intimidating in some way to look at, because like an annual edition, 10 eye-popping layouts, and it's like you look at it and you think, oh my gosh, could I ever build anything like that? And it's like, never, it's not gonna happen. But, so you look at it and you can get inspired, but you have to be careful not to get, intimidated at the same time, because these are the best of the best in these magazines. They don't put stuff in Model Railroader that's like, a lash up or something like, and they have special editions, like nine guides for model railroading success. How to build, building, track planning, wiring made easy, train benchwork construction, realistic scenery. Those are all the things we talked about that the model railroaders do. So there are a number of different magazines out there, and if you're going to get into it, your subscription will run you, what are they usually like, $29 something a year for Model Railroader. It's not bad, and you could read a year's worth, and then if you decide you're not interested, give it up, but that's good. YouTube is actually a great resource as well, but with a caveat that anybody that wants to can put a video on YouTube. They may not be smart or know what they're doing, but they can put up a video that says, this is how you do this. So as you're looking at YouTube videos, you could kind of look at multiple videos from different people and kind of get a pedigree. Now, the other thing interesting about YouTube that if you do it at all, look at it, you all know, is it's like a world headquarters for haters. Because anybody can go to a video and then post a comment below and say, you are an idiot, I can't believe you did that. So comments themselves are not necessarily indicative of the intelligence of the video you just watched. But you can look at the comments and kind of see, like, are there a lot of positive comments? Maybe this guy knows what he's talking about, I don't know.
The other thing too is that there are forums. For instance, O-Gauge magazine actually has a forum for O-Gaugers, and they monitor the forum very closely. So if somebody steps out of line or something, they take care of it.
That can be better.
And so you know, if you find a forum where there's some good monitoring, you know, they can be really productive places to be.
That's it. YouTube can be sketchy that way. It's not moderated at all, but I made a note. You'll see it in there, and this is just me talking. I don't necessarily say I have the only answer, but I've enjoyed watching videos from the user whose name is CNLVN. The LVN part is Lion Valley Northern. I think CN is Canadian National. He kind of models in Canada. They are Canadian, in fact. North of the border, they do model railroading. Well, they have more winter too than we do. So, but
More time
this
to work
fellow,
on the
Chris is his name, Chris Lyon. He has a number of really good videos that get into operating, and he does layout tours. And his are quite well done. And he has interactive discussion with the modeler. So, and his, I think, are well received. You can learn about operations and learn about, you know, layout design. An interesting thing about him that I hadn't known until I watched a couple of his videos is his railroad is entirely flat. He doesn't put any, it's like it makes it easy to operate. There's no hills. It was easier to build, and it's not as many hassles and so on. But he mentioned that in one of his videos, one of the guys mentioned that his layout is entirely on the flat. You don't have to worry about uncoupling a rail car and having it rolling a little ways or something. But they addressed that in a particular issue of Model Railroader magazine, in fact, having a little wire thing. You can have a little rod on the side of your layout, and you flip it, and it pops up a little wire thing. It'll keep your cars from rolling if you... But it simulates putting the brakes on the cars, which in real life you have to do before you can walk away from them. Anyway, there's another user that I think is really exceptional in the model railroading field is Bill Rogers. If you search him on YouTube, he has a number of videos, and he works with a particular model railroad museum, in fact, in Colorado. But he has his own layout. He has some really nice work that he showcases, and one of the fun things he's done a lot of, and there are a lot of cab rides on YouTube, meaning they've taken their locomotive and they put a flat car in front of it with some kind of a GoPro or some modern kind of camera, and they run it around the layout, and it's called a cab ride. So you become a total train nerd if you sit at home some night and watch cab ride videos. At that point, you've reached rock bottom at that point. But he's got some really nice cab rides going through the Colorado Model Railroad Museum. And it can give you like an hour of interesting viewing. But you'll see, you know, some really good scenery and some good layout stuff. He's got a lot of good stuff there. Again, I recommend him. Another user, I think this video used to be in the library system, The World's Greatest Hobby, did a VHS years ago, and I think it was on DVD. The only place where I've seen it lately, it's not in the library network, is on YouTube. If you look for the username Greatest Hobby, they have that set of videos there. And in that set of videos, it's introduced by Michael Gross, the actor, who is an avid model railroader. The other big one, by the way, to the side is, I can't think of his name, Rod Stewart, rock and roll fame. guy, he's got a massive model railroad, but he's got an estate manager that helps him build it and keep it going, so it's many thousands of square feet. But anyway, the world's greatest hobby is the username on YouTube. You can see that set of videos, and they have a guy, he builds a 4x8 layout with 18-inch curves, and does it from start to finish. He builds the benchwork, makes a tabletop, uses stacked foam for scenery, puts together some plastic building kits, does some paving of streets using plaster, and operates the railroad. It's a nice set. It's a good introduction to a lot of the different elements of it. Well, I'm glad that you folks could make it tonight.
Thank you for doing it.
Thank
Very
you.
nice.